All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in. I know that this is not your preferred thing to be doing at 7 o'clock at night on a Thursday. I know you'd probably rather be playing PlayStation, doing all the fun stuff. I'm not advertising for this, but I love bubbly water, and I've been talking all day, so my throat is a little bit blah. I know that a lot of you guys have tuned in already. Some of you guys are tuning in for the first time. So I'd like to just kind of briefly go over what we're doing. First, I'm going to briefly go over all of the key concepts. So I'm going to go straight from the AP book. And the way that I'm going to do is I'm going to read through it, and then that way you kind of have an idea of what we are going for, because our test is based directly from the key concepts. From there, you guys can ask questions, and I'll address them. A lot of you have already started posting your questions in the side, which is awesome. That gives me the opportunity to just roll through them and keep going. A couple that I'd like to address kind of before we get rolling too fast. There have been some kind of clerical things. First, the extra credit, that depends on the class. I know for my class, extra credit is due tomorrow at the end of school. I'm going to leave it kind of open all day. I don't anticipate that you guys need the day, and I don't want you to be working on it during school, but that's there for just in case there are technical difficulties. And then let's see. Eggs Benedict, that's because you're a smart person who has Topo Chico on the brain. I understand that you have the same brand of water because it's the bomb. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start this off. I've got a couple of questions on the side that we can go ahead and run through. So now let's go ahead. Let's just run through these key concepts really quickly. I'm just going to kind of talk through them. I won't necessarily go too far into depth, but I'm letting you know exactly what we are looking for. So for the first concept of this, there are three concepts in this unit. Concept number one is talking about how states and empires increase in size and how contact between these regions multiplied, how people transform their religious and cultural systems during that. Religious and belief systems provide the social bond and ethical code to live by. These shared beliefs also influence and reinforce political, economic, and occupational stratification. That's that hierarchical system that we always live with in pretty much all of these societies. We have religious political authority often emerging as rulers, some of whom are considered divine. For example, in Egypt, we have the pharaoh who's considered the god king, but that's been around for a while. And then we also have some divine divinities kind of given to both the Persian emperors as well as the Roman emperors are considered divine as the son of Jupiter. Religion, along with military and legal structures, they use that to justify their rule and to ensure the continuation of that rule. Religions and belief systems also will generate conflict, partially because beliefs and practices will vary greatly within and among societies. So this is one of those conflicts that we're going to see continue throughout the whole narrative of our course. And this is the narrative that as everything grows and religion grows and things come into contact with each other, it's going to spawn off conflict. So key concept number two, as the early states and empires grow in number, size, and population, they frequently compete for resources and will come into conflict with one another. As they're in this quest for land, wealth, and security, some empires expanded dramatically. The ones that we're talking about here are like Persia, Rome, Han China, these ones that are just grabbing more and more land and getting bigger and bigger to the point where eventually they're unable to actually sustain themselves. In doing so, in expanding, they build a powerful military machines and administrations that were capable of organizing human activities over long distances. They created new groups of military and political elites to manage their affairs. So we're talking about the rule of military in a lot of these places. Two of the easiest ones to see that are, again, Rome and Han China, as well as Persia. In India, the Gupta didn't so much use military, but they were that weird exception that proves the rule. As these empires also expanded their boundaries, they will also face this need to develop policies and procedures to govern their relationships with ethnically and culturally diverse populations, especially in Persia and Rome, as well as in Han China, sometimes to integrate them within an imperialist society and sometimes to exclude them. In some cases, the successes of these empires will create further problems, as we all are well versed in now. By expanding their boundaries too far, they create political, cultural, and administrative difficulties that they could not manage. Once they get too big to manage, these empires start to crumble. They also experience environmental, social, and economic problems when they overutilize the land, they overfarm it, and they overutilize their subjects, especially with like the corvée labor and slave labor, and when disproportionate wealth becomes concentrated in the hands of privileged classes. Finally, with concept 2.3, with the organization of large-scale empires, the volume of long-distance trade increased dramatically. Much of this trade results from the demand for more raw materials and luxury goods. Land and water routes are going to link many regions of the Eastern Hemisphere. We're going to talk about Indian Ocean trade, for example, Mediterranean trade, Trans-Saharan, and the Silk Road. The exchange of people, technology, religious and cultural beliefs, food, crops, domesticated animals, and disease pathogens will also come alongside these trading of goods. This is what we call an unintended secondary consequence. At first, we just want to kind of trade goods, but we realize over time that we're not just trading goods, we're also trading bacteria, we're also trading cultural aspects, language, religion. All of this goes alongside whenever you have two different cultures coming into contact with each other. Sorry if you guys hear my dog barking in the background. She doesn't know where I am, so she's complaining. All right, where were we? All of this develops alongside trade in goods across extensive networks and communications of change. Also in the Americas and Oceania, localized networks developed. Again, that's kind of something that we're going to hit more on in the next unit. We want to make sure that we can trace that all the way through. So don't worry too terribly much about that. Just kind of be focused on the fact that that's coming. So what we're going to do now, I have just hopped on to the chat to kind of check. We're going to start off. I have a question for the similarities between Han and Mauryan. And for that, that's a larger concept, but we can go ahead and hit that. So the Han Dynasty and the Mauryan Empire, both of them did fight wars of expansion. Both of them had strong rulers to start with. The Mauryan Empire kind of faded, though, after Ashoka. It didn't have as much. It didn't hold on nearly as long as Han. The cultural aspect of it might be a little bit similar as well, because in India, you do have a very similar culture all the way across. And in China, the Han did kind of force that that cultural aspect of Chinese culture. They kept forcing new people that they've taken over to adapt to Chinese way of life. Let's see. Do we have to know the technologies that diffused on the trade routes? Benjamin, that one's going to be more towards the next unit. The thing about trade routes is we will have, I think it's 2 questions on the test deal with the trade routes. But right now, what you guys know about that is kind of vague. You understand the concept of what those routes are. You understand that they did come about during this time, and you understand that technology is traded. You understand which technologies and goods are traded, but you don't really see the impact of it yet. Without seeing the impact, I don't really want to test you guys just yet on that. So we will definitely hit on that next unit. Don't worry too much about the technologies diffused for this test in specific. Elia wants me to go over Greek philosophers. There are 3 of them that we really covered in depth. There are some other mathematicians that are pretty easy. I mean, you guys know Pythagoras because you know the Pythagorean theorem, a squared b squared equals c squared. You know Eratosthenes, he's the one who found that the earth was round. Well, maybe not found that the earth was round, but rather found its circumference. He did that by sticking 2 poles in the earth and measuring the shadows. They knew that the earth was round back then, and yet still somehow we are having a little bit of trouble figuring that out for ourselves. But the 3 philosophers that we really studied, we've got Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato. The way that goes, we've got Socrates first. He's the one that really starts to ask why. He comes up with this Socratic method, which, for lack of a better explanation, it's like that petulant child, that horrible little child. You have a younger sibling, or perhaps you just see a kid in public where they ask their parents why. You say, hey, we're going to go ahead. We need to go shopping so we can get food. And they say, okay, why? So, you explain to them, well, we need to make sure we don't go hungry. And they say, okay, why? So, well, our bodies need food in order for us to work. And then, we get hungry if we don't have it. And they say, why? You're like, I don't know. Just stop asking why. That comes from the Socratic method. That's kind of, he put a terminology to it and a method to it. The idea is you're not telling somebody what's going on like I'm doing right now with you guys, but instead you're asking questions to provoke thought. You're asking questions to get people to think things through. And you don't necessarily have an end goal in mind. You're just asking to learn. Other than the Socratic method, he basically got killed because, well, not killed. He had to kill himself. Athens went through a little bit of a civil war, and turns out that people who are in charge don't really like people who question whenever you're trying to expand your control. So Socrates was basically given a choice. He was put on trial for corrupting the youth. He was found guilty, and he was given the choice of being put to death or drinking poison. He chose to drink the poison. After Socrates, his student Plato, who wasn't originally planning on becoming a thinker or philosopher, but after Socrates' death, he did. Plato starts writing down all of Socrates' thoughts so that they'll continue on in history. After that, Plato starts to kind of come up with his own stuff, and he has Socrates in different discussions, the most famous of which we know as the Republic. So Plato's Republic is talking about the ideal system of government. The way that works is he goes through all the different methods that have happened. He goes through Spartan oligarchy, the rule of the few, and he says the bad side of that is like the aristocracy, where you have important people who don't really do much. You have the idea of monarchy there, one ruler, and the idea there is that you have one strong ruler, and that can be a very good king. But then on the other hand, you have the tyrants, and they are overpowered. Then you have democracy, and that's the Athenian way. Democracy is where you have a rule of the many, and that can turn into mob mentality rule is what he's afraid of. So what he says is the best leadership comes from what he calls the philosopher kings. So kings who are well-versed, who think, who critically analyze everything, and who are basically philosophers in their own right, but also have the ability to rule. And these guys are Plato's ideal ruler, and they basically take care of the people and they shepherd them in the way that they know is best. So after Plato, we do end up with Aristotle, who's a student of Plato. He's important because a couple of reasons. Number one, he teaches Alexander the Great, Aristotle, and Aristotle also comes up with the method of logic that we use today. If this is true and this is true, then this must be true. Or if this is true of this and this, it must equal this. For example, if man is a political animal and a bear practices politics, then a bear must be a man. It's flawed logic in that sense, but the idea is sound. If this, then that. That logic is what Aristotle comes up with. So those are the three big philosophers that we need to worry about for this unit. Other than that, there's just those mathematicians that we talked about. Let's see what else we have here. Mediterranean sea trade. For Mediterranean sea trade, that one's more about, for this test unit anyway, that one's more about the different cultures that were around the Mediterranean. And in that we have the Phoenicians first. They're the guys who created that phonetic alphabet, the one that goes by sound. After the Phoenicians kind of tucked away, their most famous colony, Carthage, is going to kind of create a big empire in the South Mediterranean. We have the Romans, who come after the Greeks and the Hellenites and the Macedonians. The Romans are over here. They're the Latins and the Etruscans, and there was another group I just can't recall right now. But basically, the sea trade is between all of them because they're trying to bounce back different goods, and they do this through the centralized island of Crete. And this is where we have the Minoan and Mycenaean cultures kind of start. The Minoans were first, and they were the ones who kind of had that, the bull is a big symbol in that culture. They also had early corsets. And then after that, we see the Mycenaeans, and this is where we have the real start of Greece. The Mycenaeans are the ones who do the Trojan War, as in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the Mycenaeans also kind of have the culture that becomes what we know as Greek culture, the Greek Parthenon and all of that. And then after Greece gets kind of going, it has its own city-states, and they all come up with their own cultures, and they trade and colonize themselves. The Phoenicians, again, had in Carthage, and once that empire started to spread, they mostly traded through timber and that purple dye from the snails. And then when we come to the Eastern Mediterranean, that's mostly olives and olive oils that are traded around there. So by and large, the Mediterranean trade mostly just focus on the cultures themselves more so than the individual goods that were traded. Let's see. All right. Can I go over, what was the next one? Okay, Rayamana, I'll tell you right now, you don't need to worry about that for the test. Not this one. The American civilizations. Michael is asking if I could briefly go over the American civilizations. Right now, we haven't gone too far into depth with them because we kind of wanted to make sure that that was a cohesive unit. So right now, what we know about the American civilizations, we start off with the Olmecs, and we don't know too terribly much about them. So we know about the Olmec heads, and they were most likely depictions of their rulers or important people, heroes. The Olmecs, then their culture kind of morphed and eventually joined up with what will become the Mayan culture. Now the Mayans, they practiced, and again, this one we haven't covered too far yet, so don't worry too much about this. But they practiced some interesting religions that they're going to last for a while, and the Mayan civilization does last for quite a long while. They build kind of similar to the ziggurats in Mesopotamia. They build a stair-stepped pyramid, and they do practice human sacrifice as well. The Mayans had a very big empire on the Yucatan Peninsula, and we're going to cover them more whenever we start. I think it's actually next week that we're really going to get into them, where we're going to talk about them and the Incas as well. Other than that, we've got the Chevan down south in the Andes, and they become the Mochi culture. And that's something that, again, we are going to look into as the Mochi slowly morph and become what will eventually be the Incas. So as far as the American cultures go, that's kind of what you need to have an idea of. They're there during this time, but we're really going to hit on that next week with the start of more trade routes. Let's see, key concept. Why was religious diversity so important for India is what Jillian is asking. Jillian, I need a little bit of clarification on that point so that I can address it the right way. So I'm going to skip that for now. Could you please just kind of clarify what you're trying to ask so I can make sure that I answer it correctly? So I'm going to move on to Lauren's comparison between Han and Qin. We're going to go ahead and do that. And Hannah is also asking about the importance of the Zhou in the Third Dynasty, and you did spell it correctly, Hannah. So what I can do really is I can go from Zhou all the way through the Han, and that kind of is one cohesive storyline. So what happens with the Zhou? The Duke of Zhou claims mandate of heaven whenever he takes over the Shang. The mandate of heaven, of course, not being the mandate of a god, but of heavens is probably a better term for English. So the mandate of heaven claims that you have control because heaven gives you that control. You have the power because the heavens agree that you should be a benevolent leader. And so long as you keep that accord, you keep being a benevolent leader, you'll hold on to it. The Zhou said that the Shang had stopped being benevolent and they started being cruel, and that's why the Zhou were able to seize the mandate of heaven. However, the Zhou were unable to really hold on to the mandate of heaven for terribly long. And eventually, what we now know as China plunges into chaos. And we have several different states in China kind of competing to see who's going to take control. Among these 26 or so different states that are fighting for control is the Qin. And they're the ones who actually come out on top. Just as a little side note, this is whenever we do get the writings of Confucius and Lao Tzu. They're trying to figure out how to deal with the Warring States period. So we have Taoism and Confucianism start. But what really wins out during the Warring States period is legalism. The reason it wins out is because the Qin are able to keep order within their nation in a time of complete chaos. Number one, and number two, the system of meritocracy that goes with legalism and the value that are placed on farmers and soldiers help to bring that country to an advantageous position. They're able to actually take control. So the Qin, with their system of meritocracy, what that basically looks like is soldiers had to actually bring heads of their enemies in order to gain rank. They had to prove that they were worthy of the new position in order to get it. And it may not seem very revolutionary now, but back then you didn't really have a system of meritocracy. Most of the time it was built on who you were born to, what your position was. So meritocracy helped the Qin become more effective, and legalism helped them to keep control over the areas that they gained control over. And legalism basically is a system in which it's a very harsh system of punishments. Legalism believes that the vast majority of human beings are stupid, short-sighted, and at their core, evil. What that basically does is means, sorry, let me back up. What that basically means is that the rulers, the state, they're the only ones who look forward, look toward the future. People just look very short-sighted at what benefits them right now. But the state, it looks at what's going to benefit everyone down the line. In order to take care of its people, legalism says that the state needs to make sure that they have a very harsh system of punishments and very big rewards to gain. So if you've got big rewards and big punishments, people are going to work very hard to make sure that they are where they need to be. Legalism keeps people in check. Now, don't get me wrong. This is a very harsh system of governance. It is brutal sometimes, but it's done from a place of care. Legalist rulers truly care for their people and want to make sure that they are taken care of, that evilness does not consume society. So they're acting as somewhat of shepherds to their people and trying to make sure that they do what they need to do. So as the Qin grow, this harsh system of punishment benefits them. They're able to keep control over the land that they gain. Unfortunately, after only 11 years, their dynasty collapses. And the reason is the first emperor, Xiongdi, he was taking mercury pills, which were meant to make him immortal, but had the exact opposite effect. We're going to see that again with gunpowder in the Tang, so heads up on that. So he tries for immortality and ends up accidentally kind of killing himself. And he leaves control with his second son, who was kind of inept at ruling. And that son does end up killing himself by slitting his own throat. After that, China, or what we now know as China, looked like it was about to crumble back into chaos. It was about to go back into what looked basically the Warring States period. But then the Han swoop in and take control. The Han were very effective rulers. They did away with the system of legalism. They viewed it as far too harsh and instead instituted this policies of Confucianism. And the idea of Confucianism that worked really well for them was this idea of hierarchy. Everybody keeps in their own place. Confucius said that if you're a father, stay a father, be a father. If you're a son, be a son. If you're a ruler, be a ruler. In other words, guys, stay in your own lane. That's all he's trying to say. Just do what you were told to do and just do it well. Confucianism also, it boosts this idea of education. It places great value on education. And what that does is it actually creates a system in Han where you have a civil service exam to make sure that you are fit to rule as a government official. That benefits Han greatly. Instead of just putting some random person in, they actually have to prove that they're worthy of that post. Sorry, one moment, please. Okay, there we go. Let's see. So we were in Confucianism. We were talking about Meritocracy. So the civil service exam was a kind of another example of meritocracy, just instead of in the Qin, it was in the Han. What the Han did differently than Qin, number one, they had strong rulers at the get-go. We had Han Wudi, for example, who expanded militarily. He took over what's now part of what's now Korea and part of what's now Vietnam. In Vietnam, he met with a little bit of resistance from the Track sisters, but from the Trung sisters, but that didn't last too long, and Han was able to actually create a larger state. The way that that worked in their favor is they're able to keep control of that by spreading what is Chinese culture. They spread the language of Chinese. They basically force them to speak and write in Chinese. And they also force them to marry into Chinese families. So any new area that they're taking over, they are essentially creating a homogeneous culture, a culture that is all the same, rather than having a fragmented culture like, for example, Persia. As the Han continue to expand, they become bigger and bigger. And as you get bigger, it becomes harder to control. One way that they tried to combat this was by a system of roads. And as they're building these roads, they build them the same way. The idea being, if every road is the same distance or the same width, and every wagon is the same width, you're not going to break as many wheels. Everything's going to go smoother. And it does. They also standardize a system of money. So things are looking really good in the Han Dynasty. And in fact, the Han Dynasty is kind of what every future dynasty looks back on and says, yes, that, I want to be that. The Han is basically the Regina George of China, Chinese dynasties, rather. So the Han, though, eventually get too big to handle, number one. They start getting attacked from the outside by the Xiongnu in the north, which are nomads that we aren't really sure might possibly be the Huns. Probably not, maybe so. So the Xiongnu are attacking Han China, and this is why Han starts to build a Great Wall. And again, this one's not the Ming Dynasty Great Wall that's built of brick. This one is the Han Dynasty Great Wall that is a mound of dirt. So they do eventually triumph over the Xiongnu, which in turn leads to more nomadic groups gaining power and starting to attack. So it actually kind of bounces back at them. These nomadic groups are important because they do help to form that Silk Road between Han China and Rome. In addition, they do have some internal struggles. Number one, we have the spread of disease. As trade goes, again, so does disease. And also, number two, we have an internal revolution led by Taoists. This is called the Yellow Turban Rebellion. The Yellow Turban Rebellion lasted for about 30 years, and Han tried and finally put it down. But at that time, their infrastructure was so battered that the weak leaders that the Han was left with were unable to live up to what they needed. And so eventually, what we now know as China collapses back into something similar to the Warring States period that we call the Three Kingdoms time. And so the Three Kingdoms, again, there are three different areas fighting for control, and that's where we're going to pick up the story of China in our next unit. So for our next question, could you please explain the crisis of the 3rd century? It was a little confusing. All right, so I'll go ahead and kind of briefly break that one down. You don't need to go way too far into depth into that. The crisis of the 3rd century speaks to the weakness of what Rome has become. Number one, we go through a slew of awful, awful leaders. And during that whole time, we only have like 3, I think, emperors who die of natural causes. Everybody else is assassinated by either their guard, the Senate, or they are just flat out assassinated, die in battle, a lot of them too. And then eventually what happens is these Roman Empire, the emperors are weak. They're unable to gain control. Nobody really knows what's going on, and they're moving from emperor to emperor. It was basically a death sentence to become the emperor. So nobody who was worth actually having as the leader wanted to be the leader. So that weakened Rome greatly. And then they were also met with a whole bunch of other problems at the same time as having weak leadership. You have a slew of different plagues that break out. We had 2 different plagues that broke out during this time. The third one, the Justinian plague. I would argue that Constantine and Justinian were actually fairly strong leaders. So they were actually able to deal with the plague up until they weren't, because that was something that was unheard of during that time, the Black Death. Justinian himself catches it and dies, and man, like 1 out of every 4 in Constantinople just dead. But back, sorry, I go on tangents. Back to the 3rd century crisis. We have weak leaders. We have plagues coming in, sicknesses coming in, which are going to lead to weakness in people. You have the army, which is loyal to the generals and not to Rome itself. So they're basically kind of declining into almost a civil war, and then an actual civil war. And then they're also being attacked from the outside with weak borders by barbarians, what they call barbarians, because again, they're super big on Greece. They're like, yo, Greece, we also call people who aren't us barbarians, you know, only Greeks and Romans, right? So these barbarians known as the Visigoths, the Goths, the Huns, notably with Attila, all of these are invading at the same time. So basically the 3rd century crisis is just this mess of having a weak leadership that's unable to cope with the huge amount of problems that are being thrown at Rome all at the same time. Not to mention the fact that the seclusive dynasty is also kind of starting to encroach on Roman territory. Could I also go over the concept of, oh man, there's so much going on right now in the chat. Okay. Concept of Buddha Vista in Mahayana Buddhism. Buddha Vista, you won't need to know that specific for the test tomorrow. So Michael, I don't want to dissuade you from finding out about it. But for right now, I'd like you to keep your head kind of focused in on our big pictures. Yule is asking about the key points of shamanism and animism. Key points are actually pretty easy to cover right here. Number 1, animism is a worship of gods that are natural forces. So like god of the wind, or praying to the wind, praying to the sun. Animism is a very basic form of worship that's not, you could kind of describe it as polytheistic, but it's mostly the fact that everything has its own spirit, and that's what you pray to. Then you also have shamanism, and that places great value on magical humans that are called shamans. Maybe not magical, spiritual humans that are called shamans. And they're able to communicate with the spirit world, and great value is placed on them in their society. The concept being, of course, for some of them, that these human beings can transform into animals. All right. All right. Ben is asking, what is up with the patriarchy unit? Ben, there's a lot up with the patriarchy in this unit. Patriarchy is defined as the increasing role of males over females, kind of that power disparage between the two of them. Sorry, not disparage, disparity. That's the word I was looking for. Kind of that growing power gap between them. Every culture kind of has its own shift in this. Chinese culture has always been fairly different, but it increases even more in our next unit. By and large, women were subservient to men during this time in China. And in all of these places that we're talking about, almost, we have that same kind of branching. In Greece, it's particularly strong. You have women who are basically confined to their own wings of the home for the most part in Athens. In Sparta, they had a bit of a stronger role. They were intended to be strong women. They were intended to raise strong warriors. And the only way that that was capable is if women had the ability to be strong themselves. They weren't able to vote, but they did have a say in politics. If you guys remember from the article, Athens and her empire, the 8-year-old daughter of a Spartan king was actually able to convince him that this guy who's asking for help in this Ionian revolt, you need to send him away because he's going to get you in trouble. He listens to his 8-year-old daughter. So in Sparta, you know, women had a little bit of more of a role. In Rome, it started off very low women's role. It started off a concept called paterfamilias. The head of the household is the father of the household. So the husband had complete control. Even the law could not enter his household. So whatever he did was deemed legal up to and including murder. But as Roman society continues, women gain more and more role. They could go out in public. They could talk politics, couldn't be an active part of politics, but could talk it. So in Rome, it was a little bit nicer than Greece, or Athens, rather. In Sparta, the patriarchy is also there, but Spartan women, or sorry, Persian women were also kind of a little bit better off than in Greece. Basically, guys, you need to realize that as we keep going, this disparity of power continues to rise and will continue to rise into our next unit. Is the civil service exam considered meritocracy, was asked by Hannah. And Hannah, absolutely. The civil service exam is a meritocracy because you're proving that you're capable of your job before you get it. So yes, that's meritocracy. Let's see. Oh, sorry, I'm scrolling through and it keeps jumping. Give me 1 second. The Gupta Empire and its fall. Charlie, the Gupta Empire it's an interesting little thing that's on the side. The Gupta Empire, it's not like the other ones that we've really covered. It expands using diplomacy. However, its fall is very much like everybody else's. As we go, the rulers get weaker and weaker, and in Gupta, your rulers got weaker and weaker as you got on. And as your rulers get weaker and outside invasions come in, and in the Gupta, it was, was it the Mongols or the Huns? Is it the Hunas, the Huns? Let me double check that to make sure that I'm not misinforming you guys. Yes, it was possibly the Huns. So they were invaded by nomadic forces when they had another wave of kind of weak emperors. So that leads to the fall of the Gupta, just like every other place. When you get weak emperors, weak rulers, your civilization is kind of bound for the downside. Can I talk about the importance of Constantine and how different cultures influenced Christianity? Constantine is important because two big reasons for you guys. Number one, he does make Christianity the main religion of Rome. He does make that shift. He also makes the shift from Rome to Constantinople, from Rome in the Mediterranean to Constantinople, still in the Mediterranean, but very far east. He does this in effort to combat their main rivals, the Seleucid Empire. This is where historians start to kind of bicker between each other. Does this constitute the fall of Rome, since we no longer are in Rome? Is this now a new empire? Or is it not until they split into East and West? At any rate, Constantine is important because of both the move to Constantinople and for making Christianity the mainstay religion of Rome. He does this during the time of 4 emperors, where he's in a civil war with the other 3, and he comes out on top. So he's able to keep it as the main religion of Rome. Also, different cultures influence Christianity. I could devote an entire video just to that. It's a very vast thing, and we're going to keep talking about it. But the easiest way that you guys can see it is the difference in physical appearance of Jesus. For example, in Eurocentric places, we see statues of Jesus that are very European looking. In fact, he was born in the Middle East, so he was a Middle Eastern nationality. No, not nationality, sorry, that's far. He was of Middle Eastern descent. He was of Hebrew descent, so he didn't look European. So that's one of the easiest ways that you can see that difference. That one we're going to hit a lot more on in the next couple of units. But by and large, you don't need to worry too much about that for the exam. All right. Oh man, I'm getting a lot of glitching comments. I hope it's not still glitching. The aesthetics. Aesthetics are very quick to talk about. The aesthetics are Hindus that practiced speaking with their gods through different ways, mostly through fasting, through prayer, and through yoga. Buddha took on aspects of aestheticism, so that's why he looked very skinny, and he probably didn't have too terribly much hair by the end of it. Jolie wants to know how the Byzantine Empire was formed. That one we're going to talk about a little bit more in the next unit, but essentially the Byzantine Empire is whenever we have the split between Eastern and Western Rome. And the Byzantine Empire is seated in Constantinople. So some argue that the Roman Empire continues through the Byzantine Empire, and that's why we're going to kind of hit that a little bit more whenever we start talking in our next unit starting next week. You do need to know about early Rome in the sense that you need to know about them overthrowing the Etruscan kings and becoming a republic. Specifically, you need to know also the republic versus democracy. In a republic, you vote for your representatives, whereas in a democracy, like Athens, for example, the direct democracy, they would choose their citizens by a random lottery to make a assembly of 500 people to do voting on direct issues, rather than voting, everybody votes on just their representative. Okay. Peter, going over the entire Roman Empire rise, trade, and fall is a little bit ambitious. I can do it very briefly. I don't know that I can go into uber detail because that would take us quite a long time. But as far as the Roman Empire, its rise goes about whenever they overthrow the Etruscan kings. The Etruscan kings were not Latin. The Latin people of Rome were controlled by the Etruscans. And at that time, Rome was a really small village. Over time, though, they got weary of their Etruscan kings. They overthrew them and instituted instead a republic. This republic had two main bodies of people. You have the plebeians and the patricians. Patricians being upper class, plebeians being lower class. Plebeians far outnumber the patricians, but the patricians have a lot more power. So the patricians were elected into Senate and gave the plebeians the ability to form their own tribunal, to which each of their tribes would be represented, and they would have a voice in government. And they doted on the fact that they gave everybody that voice, that republic voice. They also have two consuls who are basically like your executive. And each of these kind of have vetoes over each other, and they've got a little bit of power. So you have a little bit of checks and balances going on there. Over time, though, they stopped being as influential as the generals, especially following the Punic Wars with Carthage and Scipio's rise to power as a dictator. He surrendered it back. Well, in a sense, surrendered it back. But then you see this guy, Julius Caesar, he has this idea, you know, maybe I could follow his model, become a dictator, and follows that, becomes dictator for life. He proclaims himself dictator for life, and he was absolutely right. He was dictator for about almost a year, and then that was the end of his life. So he was done being dictator. So after Julius Caesar, then his adopted nephew, Augustus, adopted as his son, but he was his actual nephew. Augustus or Octavian Julius Caesar, he was also kind of following that pattern. He goes into a civil war with Mark Antony, and the two of them are fighting east and west, and Octavian ends up winning. So Augustus becomes the first citizen of Rome, the first emperor of Rome. This continues on for a great deal of time. This ushers in what we call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, in which Rome was actually able to effectively govern itself. And that, of course, ends with the crisis in the 3rd century. And once the crisis in the 3rd century happens, that's when we kind of start to get to that decline and fall. That's where we've already covered it with the Visigoths, the Gauls, all of the barbarians that are attacking from the outside, the Huns, the slew of weak emperors, assassinations, plague, pestilence, and Rome Rome has a hard time, and it just keeps having a hard time. All right, let's see. What's the importance of, oh, no, it's glitching again. Okay. It's probably glitching so much because we've been streaming for about 45 minutes here. So if you want to go ahead and reload, it'll probably make it a little bit easier for you guys to see. I'm going to stick around for about another 5 or 10 minutes here. Quick outline. Okay, Gabe would like to know, could I just give like a quick outline on all the subjects we need to know for the test? Sure. You need to know Greece, Rome, Persia, China. You need to know Egypt. You need to know Mesopotamia. You need to know the Hans, the Qin, the steppes of Asia, so the Xiongnu, the nomadic peoples, nomadic pastoralists. You need to know the first unit as well. So basically, you need to know what we have covered. I'm sorry that I can't be more specific than that without giving away like entirety. But Gabe, if you needed to spend some extra time on something, I would recommend spend some extra time on the patriarchy, patriarchal roles. Spend some extra time on the different faiths as well. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to open it up for about another 5 minutes of questions, and then I got to give it a wrap up. My dad is flying into town, and I'm going to go out and have some dinner with him, hopefully, because I am starving. No problem, Gabe. I'm sorry that I couldn't be more specific. All right. Michael says, Mr. B, in the religions quiz we had Monday, I noticed that Judaism was on the quiz. Could I briefly go over Judaism? Absolutely, Michael. Judaism is something that we kind of covered the first unit, or kind of started to. And if you guys remember really quickly, that one we really hit on with, for example, in the Assyrians, whenever the Babylonian captivity took place. They started off and probably, and this is historical speculation, we're not entirely 100% accurate or honest about this, but what we think could have happened is that they came from a city called Ur. They migrated to what they now know as Israel, or the homeland. That's where they set up shop. And then they were invaded by the Assyrians, captured and brought back to Babylon. The Assyrians are also known as during this time, it doesn't matter. That it's kind of like Neo-Babylon. But the Assyrians take over. They bring the Jews back to Babylon, where they write down the Torah, because they are afraid that they're about to lose all of their culture, and they want to have a record of it. So this is where we write down the Torah. And then once Cyrus the Great comes in, he frees the Jews from Babylon, and they return back to Israel, or their homeland. So that's one instance of diaspora, because they're not in their homeland. Once they go back to their homeland, eventually that is taken over by the Romans. And if you recall, the Romans were polytheistic, but Roman religion was very much the state religion, and the emperor was very much the son of Jupiter, the equivalent of Zeus. The Jewish faith and the Christian faith are both monotheistic, so they don't hold that up. They don't hold that to faith, and so they didn't follow suit. And so the Jewish population was, again, forced into diaspora. So they were forced into these diasporatic communities. They were forced to abandon their homeland and go to different places for a large portion of them. The Christians were also persecuted during this time and used as kind of a scapegoat whenever any plagues or bad things happened. For Judaism, there's a couple of things. You have the prophet of Moses, was the first one that we talked about, and that was that written law of the 10 Commandments. You have, in Egypt, you do have Jewish slaves. For example, though, slavery in Egypt was a little bit different. For example, you have Joseph, who was a Jewish slave, who actually was the right-hand man of the king. In Egypt, slavery just meant that you weren't free, but slavery didn't necessarily mean that you had an awful life. It just meant that you weren't free to go. And Moses does lead the people out of Egypt. He is known as a prophet in the Judaic faith, Judeo-Christian faith. Other than that, I'm trying to think if you need anything else for this test. I don't believe so. Could I be more specific on the patriarchy? Like, which one should we know for that? Ali, for the patriarchy, what you really need to know is the concept of it and how it's shown. So if you're able to look at a picture or read an excerpt and say, that's definitely the patriarchy, that means that you've got what you need for it. You don't need to know exactly what everybody's role was in every single civilization. You need to be able to identify the concept of patriarchy. Can I explain the Hellenistic? Absolutely, I can explain the Hellenistic. So to explain the Hellenistic, I've got to give you guys some context here. I can't just jump right in and be like, so Alexander the Great, right? So let me just like contextualize this. Let's take it a step back. Oh man, we have to take it 2 steps back for this to really make sense. So Persia's got beef with Athens. Persia and Athens aren't really getting along because the Athenians had kind of spurred on this revolt in Ionia. So the Persians are pretty salty and they attack Greece. This is where we see Athens and Sparta kind of connect forces, all of the little separate Greek city-states connect forces just to combat the Persian threat. And this is about 10 years of war that goes on, and the Greeks come out on top. Specifically, Athens comes out on top. So their league, the Delian League, the Athenians kind of start to take too much control and start to build a proto-empire. So they start to try and unify Greece and build and build and build. And eventually it becomes clear that only the Spartans are going to be able to stop them. So the Spartans and the Athenians go to war for about 30 years, in which time Athens is then stricken by a horrible plague that wipes out about 1/3 of their population and then also loses this war. The Persians had joined sides with the Spartans because, well, they were still salty with Athens. After this, Greece is so weakened that Philip II of Macedon is able to effectively take his troops and just move right down city-state to city-state and take over the majority of what we now know as Greece. Philip II then dies, and his son Alexander the Great, who is the reason why I am so terrified of how old I am, because he accomplished so much more than I did by my age, don't ask. Alexander the Great then starts to not only continue to conquer Greece, but then pushes into Persia. He realizes how weak they are after fighting the Greeks and fighting the Greeks again, that he's able to actually walk in, pretty much take over that empire, the entire Persian Empire, 3,000 miles wide Persian Empire, take over Egypt, push to the east and take over India. And the reason that this is called the Hellenistic era is because it's not Hellenic culture of the Greek peninsula. It's Hellenistic. So what Alexander the Great does is he has his soldiers and his generals marry into the areas that they conquer and stay there. The reason for this being he wanted to essentially enforce a Greek culture on the areas that he goes into. That helps him to retain control, kind of like the Hans would do down the line. They enforced that Chinese culture on everybody. The idea is that it would be a homogeneous culture. It would be one culture that everybody could rally behind, and it keeps it together better than a whole bunch of fragmented cultures. So that's Hellenistic, though, because if you force your culture on somebody, it's not going to remain as the Greek culture was. They don't have the same geography. They don't have the same food. They don't have the same background culture. So what ends up happening is it becomes Hellenistic or Hellenic-like. They do take on aspects of different areas. For example, in Persia, once Alexander the Great dies, the Persian Empire is still the seclusive Persian Empire. Ptolemaic Egypt is still Egypt. And all of these regions take on aspects of Greek culture and still view the Greeks as like slightly better than thou. But it's Hellenistic. It's not full-on Greek culture. So that era, you see the split into 3 different empires, and those are basically taken over by Alexander the Great's generals and their families. This continues on all the way until the Roman Empire takes over Egypt, and they fight the Seleucid Empire for quite some time. Let's see, what else do we have? Going to be heavy focus on the Achaemenid. Not a heavy focus. You need to be aware of them and you need to know what they're responsible for. You kind of need to know with the Achaemenid the whole idea of tolerance of different cultures and religions. And that all goes back to Cyrus the Great's affection for ancient civilizations. He loved the old civilizations, and he thought that they were really nifty. He liked their culture. So he kind of just let them keep doing their thing as long as they were subservient to the Persian king. Bum, 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 bum. All right. All right. Does anybody else have any questions? I'm good to keep going for a little bit here, just in case anybody has any things that they're really still confused about. If you want me to just talk through them really fast, I can do that right now. But after about 2 minutes, if we don't have any new questions, I'll go ahead and bring this to a close. Benjamin, they can be unrelated to the tests to a certain degree, yeah. All right. Explain how the religions combine in India and China. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Easiest one to see that with is Buddhism. Whenever Buddhism comes up, it is a kind of offshoot of what was Hinduism. If you guys remember, the founder was Hindu. He became an ascetic, which is a kind of a Hindu. I don't want to say monk because it's not quite monastic. A worshiper of the Hindu gods that focuses a lot on fasting and on communicating with the gods through yoga. So he does become that for a while. So he was a very skinny guy. And as this morphs into China, and we'll see this more in the Tang and the Sui dynasty coming down the line in China, but you see Buddha start to morph into that culture. And that's where we kind of come up with that fat Buddha that you guys probably see, that, you know, the tradition of rubbing the belly for good luck. That comes from that syncretic relationship. You're also going to see this happen whenever Buddhism kind of gets reabsorbed into Hinduism in a sense. He does become one of their gods because, remember, they're anthropomorphic. And that's what we see in the statue of the thousand-armed Buddha. So basically, with the religions combining, it's not so much a combination, but it's adaptations of different aspects of those religions that we see. Mohenjo-Daro, asks Hannah. Mohenjo-Daro is that's a city in the Indus River Valley civilization. That's the one that we still don't know the writing from. It's a Harappan civilization. It's one of the two big cities. There's Harappa and there's Mohenjo-Daro. And those are the ones from the last unit. And you basically need to know that one because it's one of the two big cities of the civilization. And we still don't know what they did. We can guess. There's a large bath there, so they're good at plumbing. But without a written language, we're kind of just like piecing it together a little bit. So by and large, that's just a city you need to be aware of. So the significance of the Harappan cities is just that they're early civilizations and that they were there and they had good plumbing systems, and they traded with Mesopotamia and with other areas as well, but we still don't know too much about them. Oh, they were also nonviolent. We found some sorts, but not many. Main difference between the different Chinese dynasties. Nathan, we did cover that a little earlier, so just to kind of like break it down really simply, the Zhous kind of invented the Mandate of Heaven almost. They took the Mandate of Heaven from the Shang, and then after them it plunged into chaos in the Warring States period. The Qin were legalists, very strict rulers. They only lasted about 11 years, and then the Han came right after. What you need to know about the Han is that they were Confucianist. They were a merit-based system, the civil service exams, wars of expansion under Han Wudi. And they collapsed due to internal and external forces such as the Yellow Turban Rebellion, attacks by the Xiongnu nomadic pastoralists. And then finally, you need to know that the Silk Road did connect Han China with Rome, and it was a several tiered different way of getting there. It wasn't just one road that goes all the way through. Let's see. Rubric for the LEQ extra credit. For me, I am just double checking that you have 2 pieces of information, that it's an infographic, and that you have 3 different civilizations that you compare. If you can do that and you can prove that you can understand it and compare it well, that's the 10 points. Chin China is not spelled J-I-N, it's Q-I-N. There you go. Gabe got it. You do need to know about the basic caste division. You need to know that up at the top you have the Brahma or the mouth, the Kshatriyas, the arms. Oh man, I can't remember the bottom 2. You have the thighs, which are the skilled workers and artisans, and then you have the feet, which are the laborers. You need to kind of know that that hierarchical way is a way for Hindu states to kind of keep control. That's because the Aryans came in, they kind of came into India and they took over, and they're like, hey, let's make sure that we always, as Mr. Bell says, let's make sure that the Aryans are always at the top of that. The Brahmas, that they always listen to us. All right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to give one more round of if anybody has any questions, and then I've got it. Yes, thank you. The Vaishyas, and the Shudra are the feet. All right, cool. Excellent. Michael, Benjamin, shout out. Thank you, guys. I had a big brain fart on that one. All right. Any more last minute questions? And then other than that, guys, I just have one thing to say. There's a phrase that Roman generals used to get whispered in their ear at the beginning of every battle. You see, Roman generals, if you've kind of figured this out, they've got a big head on their shoulders. They know that they're going to be able to win. Just like you guys at this point should know that you're going to be able to win tomorrow. And yes, Benjamin, momente mora. Remember that you're going to die. They would have that momente morum all the time whispered in their ears just to kind of keep them in check. I don't mean to say that you're going to die on this test tomorrow. What I'm saying is you are confident, you are good to go, and that person whispering in your ear is just to remind you, focus on every individual question. Focus on every individual answer, try to prove them wrong, and then choose the right answer. Don't focus on the test as a whole. Whenever you're on a question, that should be the entirety of your focus, because otherwise it'll trip you up. If you keep a cool head, if you keep rolling, you guys will do fine tomorrow. Veni Vidi Vici, Cools Bros Dead. That is very, very much a Roman thing, but that one's Caesar. I came, I saw, I conquered. Memento Mori is the one that I was talking about. Yes, me too. Hey, Nathan, you almost spelled it right. All right, guys. I know you guys are going to do great on this test tomorrow. What's most important is not to stay up studying all night. Trust me. What happens is it messes with your brain. You need to go to sleep. You know who I'm talking to. You need to go to sleep. You need to have a big breakfast. Rest is more important than staying up all night cramming all the information, because all you're doing is pushing it back out the other end if you're not taking your rest. So have a good night, sleep, eat, and all right, Gabe, here's the Topo Chico. Good luck.